So again, all these things are just to get you thinking about what sort of institutions might be best for a state that is a new state and a potentially unstable state. Many of these variables revolve around a key question central to Central Asia from the start: which is more important in a transition state, stability or flexibility, representativeness or governance? And as it turns out, pretty much all over Central Asia, institutional design didn't really matter very much in many ways. It was often window dressing. What was laid out was really for show. So they might have adopted a fine parliamentary system or a presidential system. In fact, they all took presidential systems, but with more, practically all took presidential systems, but with more degrees of checks and balances. But these checks and balances didn't exist in reality. To the extent that the institutions did matter, it was in that it ordained from the beginning presidential rulers who would then turn the state into their own dominions, sometimes quasi-legally, like through referendums. So we'll talk about how all this played out, looking at the constitutional process. So constitutions determine the distribution of power within a state and provide a roadmap for how governmental institutions relate to themselves and to their citizens. And we're going to talk about how these constitutions came into being, looking at constitutional commissions, level of public discussion, the approval process, and central issues. And that really should be an I in there where it says issues or shoes. So looking at the constitutional commissions, in every state of Central Asia, all 5 states, they had a constitutional commission early on. These constitutional commissions were usually headed by former elites. Karimov personally headed the Uzbek one, Nazarbayev, the Kazakh one, Niyazov, the Turkmen one. So in 3 out of 5 states, you had the person in charge of the country running the constitutional commission. In the 4th, Kyrgyzstan, former elites, those Communist Party elites, were no longer in control. Akayev was. And in the 5th, no one was really in control because you had a civil war. So Tajikistan is a different case altogether. In Turkmenistan, Niyazov actually chaired the commission, which was launched in March of 1992. He chose really, a presidential system with extensive powers for the executive. There were also lots of lofty promises for political and economic rights. That's what he chose. In Uzbekistan, it was really like Turkmenistan. This was a policy that was led from above, and they also, not surprisingly, chose a presidential system. They also had plenty of political promises, though these political promises actually coincided with a crackdown on the opposition, and even more blatant signs of how things really were. In Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev chaired a constitutional commission. It was a non-transparent process at the start, which was a year actually before the Soviet Union collapsed, which might account for why it was so quiet. This was a period of uncertainty. But then there was much more debate in Kazakhstan, certainly than in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Nazarbayev wanted a strong presidential system because of complications of the political and economic transition, but also because of the ethnic issues that Kazakhstan faced with such a sizable Russian minority and such a small Kazakh majority. In Kyrgyzstan, which was the most democratic of all the cases, you had major disagreements about whether there should be a parliamentary or presidential system. And so they initially proposed in mid-1992 a constitution, but it took a long time to pass. They ultimately took on a presidential system, but the president was very much checked by parliament and other institutions. So this is important because Kyrgyzstan stands out in the early period of Central Asian independence as the most independent country, or I should say the most democratically independent, is what I mean to say. The most democratic, the most unbeholden to the communists. In Tajikistan, again, there was a civil war, which meant that you weren't able to put up a constitutional proposition until 1994, and even then, this was under tough conditions. You had censorship, for example. They also chose a presidential system. The last president had been removed in September of 1992. And then their constitutional commission decided to also support a presidential system. So in all these places, you get a presidential system. In Kyrgyzstan, you have a little bit more relaxed rules than in the others. Looking at the level of public discussion, these were huge issues, but not a lot of people were really understanding what they entailed. Intellectuals were involved to varying degrees, though. In Uzbekistan and Turkestan, there was a draft of the constitution that was published, and there was a bit of discussion, but the discussion took place in a state-dominated press, so it's really no surprise that there were no major changes. In Tajikistan, you had a censored press. And again, in Tajikistan, we're talking about a few years later, you had a censored press and an opposition that was really excluded from debate in the name of security and stability because they were just coming out of this civil war. And technically, they were still in the middle of the civil war, but they were really coming out. The Constitution was talked about. There was one region that even argued for a federal system in which their area would be relatively autonomous. They didn't get that. But at least there was some discussion about this. In Kazakhstan, it was a little bit different because they actually studied the constitutions of other countries. They brought in advisors from the CIS states, the Commonwealth of Independent States countries, and also non-governmental organizations, including, for example, Amnesty International. They held a roundtable. They later gave a revised version to a group of academics to look at. And finally, 4 months after extensive public debate, they moved to pass they moved to pass the Constitution. But I should also note that there was a draft constitution that was put forward by a parliamentary commission. So there was a degree of competition you clearly didn't have in Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan or Tajikistan for that matter. Now in Kyrgyzstan, where you also had extensive discussions about this, the president had one draft, but then two social organizations had their own drafts of constitutions. And you had heated parliamentary discussions, debates over which one should rule over. So you had 4 months of public debate, more parliamentary debate. There was lots of openness when it came to Kyrgyzstan. Lots of openness, unprecedented openness. So the level of public discussion was really constrained in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, the least in Tajikistan, the most in Turkmenistan. And then you had the most extensive discussion in Kazakhstan, but especially in Kyrgyzstan. And so lo and behold, where do you get the most openness? Well, you get it in Kyrgyzstan. In terms of the approval process, you have two different types we could talk about: mass level, where we have referendums, and elite levels, where we have a parliament deciding. And really, Tajikistan was the only one that put forward a referendum. In Turkmenistan, you had the Soviet-era parliament that approved the constitutional draft within several weeks of the publication of that draft. In Uzbekistan, the constitution was passed by parliament several months after it was created, but with very little change. They were just kind of sitting on it, probably because Karimov told them to sit on it. In Kazakhstan, probably in case he wanted to make any fun little changes to benefit himself. In Kazakhstan, after lots more revisions, it was passed by a huge majority in the Supreme Soviet, their legislature. And then in Kyrgyzstan, it was passed by parliament, but then revised by Akayev, the president, about a year and a half later. And we'll get into that when we talk more about the evolution of Kyrgyzstan politically. In Tajikistan, again, this is the only case where you have a referendum, but there were questions of fairness. There were allegations of falsification, of voter fraud, etc. And so the approval process varied between each one of these, but it was certainly the most where it was the most democratic, or where it appeared to be the most democratic in Tajikistan. You also had significant problems. In most of the others, it was more elite based in terms of passage. Doesn't mean it's illegitimate. It just means that you have a different way of going about it. So some of the key issues that were going on in each one of these, in all five of these post-Soviet Central Asian countries, in terms of the debates, were, one, the appropriateness of Western experience. People were weary of over-relying on Western experience when this is, after all, Central Asia. It's different. We've got a different history. We've got a different culture. We've got different ties. So do we want the Western experience? So that was a big question, especially when it came to Western European versions of parliamentary democracy. Do we need a parliamentary democracy here? What would that mean here? There was also a question of state ideology. Do you need a state ideology that's secular? Do you allow Islam in? How do you allow for Islam to take part to take a place in the Constitution? What should be the role of religion? But really, the major concern here was about political power. There was the questions about the place of the Russian language, and there were also many socioeconomic considerations. And so we'll talk about these in particular. So looking at political power, especially where you had more democratic discussions in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, there were lots of questions about the power of the presidency. And there was fear that there would be the strong man who would guide the transition, which is great, but that this person might become a dictator fairly quickly. This was much less a factor where you already had a clear dictator, right? In Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, you already had a clear dictator, and public discussion was really limited. But even here, there was some questioning of presidential authority. In all five, there were questions about the potential abuse of presidential power. These questions were just sharper in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. In Turkmenistan, some in the press questioned the wisdom of allowing the president, for example, to appoint judges. Not a major issue, but still an issue. And not a major issue in terms of the president, but it is a major issue in terms of the functioning of the state. There were more extensive debates in other states, obviously in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. In Kazakhstan, there was concern about the appointments of local administration heads, the governors, demands for elections instead. So these sorts of things came up. It was all about the power of appointment and political power. This was clearly a post-Soviet crowd because there was a fear of a strong hand out of control. Of course, that strong hand out of control wasn't Moscow anymore, now it was the local capitals. There was also this fear of old, sickly, ineffective presidents, like they had in the Soviet Union in the dying days of the Soviet Union. Remember, between Brezhnev and Gorbachev, you had two presidents who were sort of put in there and didn't really have a solid place. In other words, everyone knew that they weren't going to last very long. So should we put, for example, an age cap on the presidency? Should there be a strong parliament to check the president? In Kyrgyzstan, the most liberal, the president appointed the prime minister rather than parliament appointing the prime minister. So you have a different accountability mechanism here. The president in Kyrgyzstan also was responsible for appointing local administration heads, although these were subject to agreement by locally elected bodies. So there was some sort of check on this. And this is the most democratic example. In Kazakhstan, also, rather than a government being accountable to parliament, it was accountable to the president. So you lack this accountable president or prime minister to the legislative body. There was also a question of how to deal with the ethnic issue, now that quote-unquote Soviet man is being buried. Does the president have to be a member of the titular nationality, as in Turkmen and Turkmenistan, or just a citizen who knows the local language? And this is exactly what they took in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Still, note that this is exclusionary because lots of the people don't know the local language. I already mentioned that in Kazakhstan, about 1% or so of Russians, actually ethnic Russians, spoke Kazakh. So this would rule them out. In terms of minorities, since we're on that, minority protections were a big issue, especially language. Between 1989 and 1990, all the Central Asian republics, they were still republics at that point, adopted laws that said that in the state administration and in the educational institutions, the local language would take precedence. In other words, Uzbek in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyz in Kyrgyzstan, etc. But they also promised a phase-in period. And they also put in some guarantees for Russian in most cases. So Russian could be sort of a backup language. There were real reasons why Russian speakers didn't know the local language. They didn't need to. Under the Soviet Union, with Homo Sovieticus, with the Soviet man, the Russian language was supposed to be the language of communication. And so why would you bother to learn these other languages that were eventually going to die out anyway? It's also important to remember that in many states, many of the titulars did not know their local language as well. They grew up in Russian schools. They used Russian around work. This is especially important when we're talking about the political elites, who of course rose up the political ladder thanks to the fact that they were good Soviet Homo Sovieticus. They were good Soviet citizens, not Uzbek citizens or Turkmen citizens. So, for example, Karimov in Uzbekistan had to learn Uzbek. He didn't speak Uzbek fluently. Language policy was not for show. It was a very concrete issue, since there was a fear of this mass exodus of Russians, and also this fear that Russia could use this in foreign policy with regards to these new states. The Russian ambassador to Bishkek, for example, delivered a letter from Yeltsin requesting special status for Russians in their new constitution. There was constantly the fear that Russia could turn against the Central Asian states and decide to come back in. In some ways, the constitution-making process was really the way to open up the ethnic issue more broadly. In the Turkmen constitution, not only was there talk of Turkmen as a local language, but there were also frequent references to Turkmen people rather than citizens of Turkmenistan. And there's a big difference, right? They even have, in Russia, for example, you can be Ruski, which means Russian, ethnic Russian, or you can be Rossiyski, which is Russian state Russian. Very different. So at this point, there were Russian accusations of discrimination that were really backed by the fact that even if many of the Russian speakers wanted to learn the local language, they would still be stuck without the facilities to do that. And then they couldn't be in certain administrative positions and educational positions that many at the time had occupied and had always occupied. Okay. So I'll take this on another set of slides because I'm kind of going on for a while.